If you ever smell rusting iron and rotting meat in the middle of a forest, don't look back. Just run. Because that means you've already crossed the border into Rakhtgarh. And the Lord of the Flayed Skin has already caught your scent. Welcome to the city of the Skinless. Deep within the dense and desolate forests of Uttarakhand lay a small village, Rakhtgarh. Years ago, its name was erased from the Indian map forever. The reason? The brutal massacre of all 400 villagers in a single night. The corpses were so horribly mutilated that it was impossible to tell which parts belonged to humans and which to animals. The police closed the file, and since that day, no one has dared to set foot on the soil of Rakhtgarh. Rohan, a famous investigative journalist, and his cameraman Kabir set out to uncover this mystery. They thought it was just a myth, a superstition fabricated by the locals. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. The journey and the silence when their jeep entered the borders of Rakhtgarh. It was 6 p.m., but thick black clouds had already swallowed the sky. It felt as though night had claimed the hours early. Suddenly, the rain started, heavy, piercing drops that battered the jeep's windshield, sounding as if someone were striking it in a blind rage, without warning. The jeep's engine sputtered, jerked, and died. Damn it. The engine seized, Rohan muttered, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. Kabir's face had turned completely pale. He looked outside. Through the dense trees, the crumbling ruins of the village were barely visible. Bro, I don't get a good feeling about this place. There's a strange stench. Rohan rolled his window down a fraction. Kabir was right. It wasn't the fresh smell of wet earth in the air. The wind carried the sharp, sickening stench of rusted iron and rotting flesh, exactly like the smell of fresh blood. The door of the old mansion, grabbing their backpacks and flashlights. The two made a run toward the largest structure in the village to escape the downpour, an old, dilapidated mansion. The massive wooden door was slightly ajar. The moment they stepped inside, a gust of freezing wind hit their faces. The heavy door slammed shut behind them with such violent force that the entire mansion echoed. Bam! Rohan immediately tried to pull the door open, but it was jammed so tightly it felt as if someone had sealed it shut from the outside forever. "We're trapped," Kabir said, his voice trembling uncontrollably. He turned on his night vision camera. Through the eerie green tint of the screen, the mansion's massive hall looked like a death trap. There were strange marks on the walls. Rohan shined his flashlight on them. It wasn't paint. They were dried, bloody claw marks starting from the floor and dragging all the way up to the ceiling, as if someone had been dragged by their feet up the wall and left to hang from above. The first scream, just then, the sound of someone crying, echoed from the upper floor of the mansion. It was a woman's voice. The sobs were so agonizing and filled with pain that they made Rohan's hair stand on end. "Is anyone there?" Rohan shouted into the darkness. The crying abruptly stopped. Pin-drop silence. The only sound in the room was their own racing heartbeats. Then, a faint noise echoed from above. Chink, chink, the sound of anklets. But this wasn't the sound of footsteps walking on a floor. It sounded like someone was walking upside down on the ceiling. Kabir slowly raised his camera. Through the night vision lens, he looked at the ceiling above them, and the breath caught in his throat. Rohan." His voice cracked out. Rohan looked up. A shadowy figure was clinging to the ceiling like an insect. Its legs were broken, unnatural, grotesque angles, and its long matted hair hung down toward the floor. But the most terrifying detail was its eyes. They were completely white and dead, and thick black blood was steadily dripping from its lips. Ghosts do not obey the laws of physics. The shadow snapped its neck 180 degrees to look directly at them, flashing a wide, horrifying smile made entirely of razor-sharp teeth. A drop of blood fell squarely onto Rohan's cheek. It was warm. The game of blood, the flashlights, suddenly started flickering wildly. Flick, flick. Bam! Pitch black darkness swallowed the mansion. "Kabir, turn on the light!" Rohan screamed in panic. In the dark, a terrifying woman's laughter echoed. When Kabir finally managed to switch his camera light back on, the sight before them drained Rohan's soul. The shadow on the ceiling was gone, but Kabir was writhing on the floor. His throat had been brutally ripped open, and blood was gushing out like a fountain, quickly painting the mansion's dusty floor a glossy red. Kabir was still alive. His eyes were blown wide open in sheer terror as he desperately tried to breathe, but his torn throat only produced a wet, sickening gurgling sound. Rohan dropped to his knees, frantically trying to stop the bleeding with his bare hands. "No, Kabir. Bro, keep your eyes open. Stay with me." His own hands were completely soaked in warm blood. Just then, taking his final ragged breath, Kabir raised a trembling, blood-stained hand and pointed right behind Rohan. Rohan's breath stopped in his chest. He slowly turned his head. Emerging from the pitch-dark shadows was a towering 7-foot-tall figure. Its skin was charred black, melting off its bones from some ancient fire, and in one massive hand, it gripped a rusted, jagged meat cleaver that still gleamed with fresh blood. The entity tilted its head and spoke in a voice that sounded like it echoed from a bottomless, rotting abyss. "Your scent is so sweet." The demon raised the heavy cleaver high into the air and leaped toward Rohan. There was nowhere to run. The heavy, rusted cleaver sliced through the air with a sickening whistle. Rohan threw his body to the right, slipping violently in the thick pool of Kabir's blood. Smash! The blade embedded itself deep into the wooden floorboards, sending splintered wood flying into Rohan's face. If he had been a fraction of a second slower, his head would have been split perfectly in two. Rohan didn't look back. Panic and adrenaline took over. He scrambled to his feet, abandoning his backpack, but snatching up his heavy-duty flashlight. He sprinted blindly into the gaping mouth of the mansion's dark, narrow corridor. Behind him, he could hear the demon ripping the cleaver from the floor with a wet, tearing sound, followed by a guttural roar that made the walls vibrate. The corridor of whispers, as Rohan ran deeper into the belly of the mansion. The air grew unnaturally freezing. Each breath he took felt like inhaling shards of glass. The corridor seemed endless, twisting in impossible angles. Thud, drag. The footsteps behind him were slow, methodical, and heavy. The demon wasn't running. It was hunting. It knew Rohan had nowhere to go. Suddenly, the beam of Rohan's flashlight illuminated a heavy iron door to his left. It was slightly open. With his lungs burning, he threw himself inside, pushed the heavy door shut, and slid the rusted iron bolt into place, just as a massive weight slammed against the other side. Boom! The door bulged inward. Dust and dead spiders rained down from the ceiling. Boom! Another strike. Rohan backed away, pressing his trembling hands against his mouth to muffle his own panicked breathing. After the third strike, the pounding stopped. There was only a suffocating silence on the other side. The slaughter. Rohan slowly turned around and swept his flashlight across the room he had just entered. His stomach churned violently, and he doubled over, vomiting bile onto the stone floor. This wasn't just a room. It was a slaughterhouse. Dozens of rusted meat hooks hung from the ceiling by heavy iron chains. But they weren't empty. Suspended from the hooks were the decaying, skinless remains of what looked like humans. Dozens of them. The stench of rotting meat, dried blood, and sulfur was so thick it was blinding. Beneath the hooks, the floor was covered in a thick, sticky layer of coagulated black blood. In the center of the room sat a massive circular stone altar, covered in deep, carved symbols that seemed to writhe in the flashlight's beam. On top of the altar lay a rotting, leather-bound journal. Rohan, fighting the urge to pass out, forced himself to walk toward the altar. He needed to know what this place was. He flipped the journal open. The pages were written entirely in dark, brownish red ink blood. The sacrifices must continue, the jagged handwriting read. Rakhtgarh will live forever. The Lord of the Flayed Skin demands meat. My wife was the first. She screamed, but her blood opened the door. The trap is sprung before Rohan could read another word. A drop of warm, thick liquid hit the back of his neck. Then another. He froze. His blood ran instantly cold. He slowly aimed his flashlight upward. Hanging directly above him, dangling from the ceiling by her own tangled black hair, was the woman from the hallway. Her broken backwards limbs twitched like a dying spider. Her pure white eyes stared down at him, and her jaw unhinged, dropping impossibly low to reveal a black abyss lined with needle-like teeth. "You read my diary," she whispered. Her voice wasn't coming from her mouth. It was echoing directly inside Rohan's head. Before Rohan could scream, the iron bolt on the heavy door behind him violently shattered. The massive, charred demon stepped into the slaughter room, dragging its bloody cleaver against the stone floor, creating a trail of orange sparks in the dark. Rohan was trapped between the hanging abomination above and the hulking butcher at the door. The demon raised its free hand, and to Rohan's absolute horror, it grabbed one of the hanging, skinless corpses by the neck and ripped it cleanly from its hook, throwing the body aside to clear a path to Rohan. "Fresh meat," the demon growled, raising the cleaver once more. The heavy air in the slaughter room suddenly felt as thick as mud. Rohan was paralyzed for a fraction of a second, his brain struggling to process the sheer, impossible terror of the two monsters closing in on him. The hanging woman dropped from the ceiling with a wet thwack. She didn't stand up. Instead, she scrambled toward him on all fours, her broken limbs moving with the terrifying speed of a massive disjointed spider. Her jaw was unhinged, black bile leaking from her needle-like teeth. At the same time, the towering demon lunged, bringing the heavy, rusted cleaver down with skull-crushing force. The desperate Rohan threw himself backward onto the blood-slicked stone floor. Crack! The demon's cleaver missed him by inches, smashing directly into the stone altar. The impact shattered the rotting journal and sent razor-sharp fragments of stone flying through the air. One shard sliced deep into Rohan's shoulder, but the adrenaline masked the pain. The cleaver was temporarily lodged in the stone. The demon roared in frustration, using both massive hands to yank it free. This was Rohan's only chance. But before he could get up, the spider woman was on him. She leaped onto his chest, pinning him to the floor. Her rotting face was inches from his. The stench of death so overpowering it made Rohan's eyes water. She opened her mouth wide, aiming straight for his throat. Rohan, acting purely on survival instinct, shoved his heavy-duty flashlight directly into her gaping mouth and smashed the power button to maximum brightness. The shoot of blood, the blinding beam of light erupted from inside her throat. The creature let out a high-pitched, ear-piercing shriek that vibrated through Rohan's very bones. She scrambled off him, clawing wildly at her own face in agony. As the demon finally wrenched the cleaver free from the altar, Rohan scrambled backward, his hand slipping on the coagulated blood. As he backed up, his hand brushed against cold, rusted metal. A heavy iron chain with a massive meat hook dangled right beside him. With a guttural scream of his own, Rohan grabbed the chain and swung it with all the strength he had left. The heavy iron hook sailed through the air and smashed brutally into the demon's charred face. It didn't stop the monster, but it tore off a chunk of its burnt flesh, causing a thick, foul-smelling black pus to ooze from the wound. The demon staggered back a single step. That was all Rohan needed. Behind the ruined altar, obscured by the shadows, Rohan spotted a large, square opening at the base of the wall. It was a wooden drainage chute designed to wash the blood and remains out of the slaughter room. It was pitch black, narrow, and reeked of centuries of decay. It was also his only way out. Rohan dove headfirst into the dark, hold just as the demon swung its cleaver horizontally, chopping the air where Rohan's head had been a second before. The descent into hell. Rohan plummeted down the steep, slick wooden chute in absolute darkness. The walls of the tunnel were coated in a thick, slimy layer of ancient gore. He slid faster and faster, twisting wildly, unable to see or stop himself. The sounds of the demon's furious roars echoed down the shaft behind him. Suddenly, the chute ended. Rohan was launched into the air and landed hard on a pile of something sharp and brittle. Crunch. The wind was knocked out of his lungs. He lay there in the freezing darkness, coughing violently, every muscle in his body screaming in agony. He slowly reached into his pocket. Miraculously, he had managed to hold onto a small backup penlight. With trembling fingers, he clicked it on. The weak beam of light cut through the pitch-black underground cavern. Rohan looked down at what had broken his fall. He wasn't lying on rocks. He was lying on a mountain of human skulls. Hundreds of them. And as the weak beam of the penlight swept across the cavern, the darkness shifted. From the shadows surrounding the bone pile, dozens of pale, glowing white eyes slowly blinked open. They had been waiting for him. The feeble beam of Rohan's penlight trembled in his bloody, bruised hands. As the light swept across the massive underground cavern, the darkness peeled back to reveal a nightmare that defied all human comprehension. The pale, glowing white eyes did not belong to animals. They belonged to people. Or, at least, things that used to be people. The sea of the damned. They crawled out from the crevices of the cavern, and from beneath the mountains of decaying bones. They were completely naked, their skin a sickly translucent gray that clung tight to their skeletal frames. Their mouths were unnaturally wide, filled with rows of jagged, broken teeth designed strictly for tearing raw meat. As they moved, their joints popped and cracked in the freezing air. There were dozens of them. No hundreds. Rohan single quotes S breath hitched as a horrifying realization hit him. The journal in the slaughter room had mentioned that the 400 villages of Rakhtgarh were massacred. But the police had never found complete bodies, only mutilated fragments. The villagers hadn't just been murdered. They had been transformed. They were the sacrifices, cursed to spend eternity in the bowels of the earth as mindless, flesh-eating ghouls, feeding on whoever the Lord of the Flayed Skin threw down the chute. A collective, wet hissing sound echoed through the cavern. They had caught his scent. The smell of fresh, warm blood from the deep gash on his shoulder was acting like a dinner bell. The face of a friend. Rohan frantically scrambled backward up the pile of skulls, the ancient bones snapping and crumbling under his weight. He desperately shined his penlight around, looking for any exit, any tunnel leading away from the horde. Suddenly, a heavy, cold hand clamped shut around his ankle. Rohan screamed and kicked wildly, aiming the light down at his attacker. The ghoul had dragged itself halfway up the bone pile. But as the beam of light illuminated its face, Rohan's heart completely stopped. It was wearing a blood-soaked jacket. A jacket Rohan recognized. It was Kabir. But it wasn't the Kabir who had been laughing with him in the jeep just hours ago. Kabir's throat was still brutally torn open, the flesh hanging in ragged flaps. But his eyes were no longer human. They were glowing, dead white. Black veins pulsed rapidly across his face, and thick, dark sludge dripped from his open mouth. The curse of Rakhtgarh worked fast. The mansion had already claimed his soul. Rohan. The voice bubbled up through the gaping hole in Kabir's neck, a grotesque imitation of his friend's final words. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a threat. Kabir's jaw snapped open, and he lunged forward, sinking his teeth directly into Rohan's calf. The blood runs deep. The pain was explosive. Rohan roared in agony, the burning sensation of the bite sending a shockwave through his nervous system. Pure survival instinct violently overrode his grief. He couldn't save Kabir. Kabir was already gone. Rohan pulled his free leg back and, kicked Kabir squarely in the face with his heavy hiking boot. Crack! Kabir's nose shattered and he tumbled backward, rolling down the pile of skulls and crashing into the advancing horde of ghouls. The brief distraction gave Rohan a split second to act. To his right, behind a massive stalagmite of coagulated blood and stone, he saw a narrow, jagged fissure in the cavern wall. A faint, almost imperceptible draft of cold. Fresh air was blowing through it, ignoring the searing pain in his torn calf and his bleeding shoulder. Rohan threw himself off the bone pile and sprinted toward the crack in the wall. The horde shrieked in unison, a deafening wave of rage, and scrambled after him like a swarm of ravenous insects. Rohan squeezed his body into the narrow rock fissure just as the first ghoul slammed against the entrance, its rotting fingers violently swiping at his face. Missing his eyes by mere millimeters, he pushed himself deeper into the claustrophobic tunnel, the jagged rocks tearing at his clothes and skin. He was trapped in the earth, bleeding profusely, with a horde of 400 cannibalistic ghouls trying to dig him out from behind Dot, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, a heavy, rhythmic thumping began to echo. Thump, right, thump, drag. The demon with the rusted cleaver hadn't given up the hunt. It had found another way down. The walls of the fissure pressed against Rohan's chest like a stone vise. Every inch he crawled forward scraped the skin from his elbows and knees. Behind him, the frenzied shrieks of the ghoul horde echoed through the narrow gap. The wet, tearing sound of their jagged fingernails scraping frantically against the rock, just inches from his boots, sent violent shivers down his spine. He could still hear Kabir's mutated, gurgling voice among them, driving the swarm forward. But ahead, the terror was quiet, methodical, and infinitely worse. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. The 7-foot charred demon was pacing just outside the exit of the tunnel. It was waiting for him. The flooded tomb Rohan's lungs burned for oxygen. His bitten calf throbbed with a venomous heat, and the deep gash on his shoulder continued to leak warm blood down his side, slicking the rocks beneath him. He had to keep moving. If he stopped, the ghouls would pull him backward by his feet and eat him alive in the dark. With a final, desperate push, Rohan squeezed his battered body through the end of the fissure and tumbled outward. He didn't hit solid ground. He splashed violently into freezing, waist-deep black water. The shock of the cold was paralyzing. He instantly clamped a hand over his mouth to muffle his own gasp. Clicking off his penlight to avoid detection, Rohan let his eyes adjust to the pitch-black gloom. He was in a massive, flooded subterranean chamber. Thick stone pillars rose from the black water to support a vaulted ceiling hidden in the shadows. The stench here was different, stagnant, ancient, and heavy with the smell of sulfur. The butcher and the swarm, a heavy splash, echoed from the far side of the chamber. Rohan froze, sinking lower into the murky water until it reached his chin. Through the gloom, a massive silhouette stepped into the water. It was the demon. Even in the dark, Rohan could see the grotesque, oozing crater on its charred face where he had smashed it with the meat hook. The monster dragged its massive rusted cleaver through the water, creating a slow, rippling wake. It was sniffing the air, searching for the source of the fresh blood. Suddenly, a cacophony of shrieks erupted from the rock fissure. Rohan had just escaped. The ghouls had squeezed through. Dozens of the pale, emaciated creatures began tumbling out of the crack in the wall, splashing wildly into the black water. Leading the pack was the horrifying, zombified form of Kabir, his nose completely caved in from Rohan's kick, black sludge pouring down his chin. The mindless horde instantly smelled the blood in the water. But in their frenzy, they didn't locate Rohan, who was hiding deathly still behind a stone pillar. Instead, they swarmed toward the largest mass of flesh in the room, the demon. A clash of monsters. What happened next was a symphony of absolute slaughter. The demon let out a deafening roar that, shook the very foundation of the chamber. It didn't retreat. It raised the heavy iron cleaver and swung it in a massive horizontal arc. Slice. 4 ghouls were instantly decapitated, their pale heads flying through the air and splashing into the dark water. Black blood erupted like geysers. But the horde didn't care. They were completely feral. They piled onto the towering butcher, biting into its charred, leathery skin with their needle-like teeth. Tearing off chunks of rotting meat, the demon roared in agony and fury, dropping its cleaver to grab 2 ghouls by their throats, crushing their windpipes with its bare hands before smashing their skulls. Together like ripe melons. Rohan watched the nightmarish bloodbath in sheer disbelief. The monsters were tearing each other apart. This was his only window to survive, the depths below taking a deep breath of the foul air. Rohan submerged himself completely under the freezing, pitch-black water. He swam blindly away from the carnage, his hands feeling along the slimy stone walls for any opening, any tunnel that could lead him out of this hell. The water vibrated violently with every splash. Scream and crunch of bone echoing above. Suddenly, his hand brushed against a metal grate at the bottom of the wall. He felt along the edges. The iron bars were rusted entirely through in the center, leaving a hole just wide enough for a man to slip through. Rohan's lungs were screaming for air. He gripped the edges of the rusted hole and began pulling himself into the underwater tunnel. But just as legs were about to clear the grate, something incredibly bad and icy cold clamped shut around his injured ankle. It wasn't a ghoul's hand. It felt like long bony fingers wrapping around him like a vice, pulling him backward into the dark depths. He opened his mouth to scream, but only freezing black water rushed in. Goodbye. Please like, share, subscribe to Vigil Shadow.